They called my name with a tone that didn't match the setting. Sharp, clipped, like I was an interruption. I stood up slowly in the courtroom, smoothing the creases in my skirt with hands that trembled only slightly. He was already there, seated beside his lawyer, who looked like she'd been born with a smirk. My ex-fiancé, the man I almost married, didn't look at me. Not once. The judge asked if I understood the accusations, and I nodded, though a lump was forming in my throat. "Miss Lee," the lawyer began, standing with that performative poise I'd come to recognize from every legal drama I'd ever watched. "It is our belief that this union was pursued solely for financial gain." I heard the words before I felt them. Gold digger, parasite, opportunist. The words fell like stones, and though none of them were said aloud in those exact terms, the courtroom absorbed them all. I looked around, searching for a face, any face that held doubt or kindness. Nothing. Even the stenographer couldn't meet my eyes. I had spent 3 years loving that man, helping build his company from a spare-room side hustle into something real. I drafted early pitch decks, ghost-wrote emails to investors, supported him through nights of doubt and failure. Now, in a cold courtroom, filled with suits and silence, I was a disposable anecdote. The only thing heavier than the silence was the weight of betrayal. And yet I sat down calmly, because the one document I never mentioned was about to change everything. The document lived in silence for over a year, filed quietly in a safety deposit box under a name that wasn't mine. It had been his idea, ironically. "Just for protection," he said one night after we clinked glasses to celebrate his first $1 million deal. "It's standard, sweetheart. Doesn't mean I don't trust you." I had read every line of that prenup. He had insisted I sign it without a lawyer, with promises sweet enough to disguise control. But I wasn't naive. I had my own copy notarized and sealed, tucked away not out of distrust, but because some part of me had always felt the ground beneath us wasn't as stable as he pretended. And now, with my character dragged through the dirt, it was time. His attorney called me manipulative, strategic with her affections, even referenced screenshots of our old texts like they were confessions instead of conversations. I didn't flinch. I waited, silent, composed, staring ahead while the gallery whispered. Then a door opened at the back of the courtroom. Calm footsteps echoed against the polished floor. And when the his CEO, walked in holding an envelope and handed it directly to the judge, the room froze. Everyone turned. Even he turned, finally, eyes wide and jaw tight. The judge examined the papers, brow furrowed, then cleared his throat. "Miss Lee's contributions were not only personal but foundational," he said, lifting the prenup for all to see. "This document outlines ownership, early investment, and co-founding acknowledgement, signed and sealed before any engagement." I didn't have to say a word. The courtroom had already heard everything that mattered. He sank into his chair like the air had left the room. His lawyer leaned over, whispering furiously, but there was nothing left to contest. The CEO's signature was right there, under his and mine. The truth wasn't just in the prenup. It was in the spreadsheets I built at 2 a.m., in the pitch deck I helped edit before his first investor meeting, in the long nights I spent fielding calls when he froze mid-negotiation. I wasn't a gold digger. I was the shovel that unearthed half the ground he stood on. But I never asked for credit. I only wanted respect. Until the moment he painted me as a parasite in front of strangers. The CEO, who had remained mostly silent for months, spoke again, this time not to the judge but to the courtroom. "I advised them both at the beginning," he said. "But let it be clear, she's the one who asked for a clause that protected both parties. He asked to remove it." My ex's face turned crimson. The whispers now sounded like a tide crashing. Cameras clicked. I could feel my hands trembling, but not from fear, from release. For so long, I'd carried the weight of silence, the guilt of loving someone who saw me as disposable the moment I challenged his narrative. But the page had turned, and as the judge declared the claims against me null, As murmurs filled the air with shifted opinions, I finally breathed again. Not because I won, but because I never needed to defend myself. The truth had always been written. He just hoped no one would read it. After court, the corridor outside felt colder than the courtroom itself. I stepped out alone, no entourage, no family waiting with open arms. Just the faint echo of footsteps and reporters gathering near the building's exit. I could hear them calling his name, not mine. Even in disgrace, he was the story. That's how it had always been. I walked past marble walls and glass reflections of a woman I barely recognized anymore. Tailored blazer, calm posture. But beneath it all, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. I had spent so long playing supportive roles that I forgot how to walk without his shadow next to mine. A soft voice stopped me halfway down the corridor. "Miss Lee." It was Mr. Han, the CEO who had handed over the prenup. He didn't owe me anything, yet he'd shown up when no one else had. "You didn't have to come," I said, my voice lower than I intended. He smiled faintly, tucking his hands into his coat. I didn't come for him. There was something in his eyes, recognition maybe, or respect. You protected him even when he didn't deserve it. That takes strength most people don't understand. I looked away, unsure how to hold that kind of compliment. My hands were shaking again. He noticed. "You didn't lose today," he added. "You reclaimed your name." I nodded, blinking back the heaviness building in my chest. Outside, cameras flashed, but inside that hallway, for the first time in months, I felt like someone saw me. Not as an accessory, not as a rumor, but as a woman who had survived. We stood there for a moment, two people bound by a truth that had almost been erased. I hadn't seen Mr. Han since the early days, back when the company was nothing more than caffeine-fueled dreams and pitch meetings in borrowed boardrooms. Back then, he'd been quiet, observant, but always respectful. And now, years later, he was the only one who didn't flinch when the accusations began. "You remembered the prenup," I said softly, still trying to understand why he had kept it all this time. He nodded. He asked me to discard it. Said you were different now. The word struck like a slap, not because they were new, but because I'd suspected them all along. I remembered the shift in his tone after his first million. The way he started correcting me in meetings, laughing off my ideas in front of others, calling me too emotional when I raised concerns. I had loved him through it, believing it was stress, pressure, fear. But maybe he had just outgrown the version of me that helped him rise. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. Mr. Han looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because I knew you'd speak when it mattered. And if you didn't, I would." My throat tightened, not from affection, not yet, but from the rare ache of being defended without asking. Outside, reporters still waited, but inside, something steadier had been restored. Maybe not trust and love, not yet, but faith in myself and in those who quietly chose truth, even when silence was easier. He offered to walk me out, but I declined. I needed to feel my steps alone, to reclaim the silence that used to terrify me. The media had shifted now, flashing lights chasing a new headline, voices eager to spin my pain into profit. Gold digger turns out to be co-founder. They'd say it like a twist in a soap opera, never acknowledging the years of erasure that came before. I moved past them, ignoring the cameras, holding my chin steady even as my fingers curled tightly around the strap of my bag. On the street, people stared, some with curiosity, others with judgment, but I didn't shrink. I crossed the avenue like I had somewhere to be, like I wasn't unraveling. At the next corner, I ducked into a bookstore I used to visit before everything became entangled in his world. The familiar scent of pages, the soft rustle of paper, it grounded me. I sat between shelves and let the quiet wrap around me. For the first time, I cried. Not because I was humiliated, but because I wasn't anymore. The version of me that had stayed silent, that had accepted less, had been left behind in that courtroom. A chapter closed not with rage, but with proof. He had called me names. The world had believed him. But a single page, signed, notarized, preserved, had flipped everything. And in that moment, beneath dim lights and between stories written by strangers, I realized I had one of my own to finish. One where no one else wrote the ending. 2 days later, the storm hadn't passed. It had only changed direction. My inbox overflowed with interviews, invitations, even apologies cloaked as business proposals. "We'd love to hear your side," they wrote, as if I hadn't spent years living it. The headlines were split. Some called me the woman behind the empire. Others still labeled me the silent fiancée. But none of them knew the nights I skipped meals to proofread his contracts, the deals I salvaged when his ego nearly sank them. I wasn't angry at the noise. I was angry at how late the world decided to listen. That afternoon, I received a message from Mr. Hahn's assistant, short, polite. He asked if you'd join him for lunch. No press. I stared at it for 10 minutes. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to avoid the complicated pulse I felt whenever I remembered his voice. But I replied yes. We met at a quiet rooftop cafe far from the skyscrapers, where his name gleamed in gold. When I arrived, he was already seated, no suit, just a simple shirt, sleeves rolled, as if trying to appear smaller than the empire he led. He stood when he saw me, not out of habit, but respect. "I thought you might not come," he said gently. "I almost didn't," I admitted. We sat, and the silence between us wasn't awkward, it was honest. "You didn't owe me anything," I added. He looked down, thoughtful. "Maybe not. But I remember who actually built the first floor of that company." And for the first time in years, I didn't deflect. I nodded, because I remembered too. The food arrived, but neither of us touched it. Our conversation lingered somewhere between business and memory. Stories we both recalled, but had never told each other. He asked if I remembered the pitch in Busan, the one where the investor walked out until I stepped in with the revised numbers. I laughed softly. "You were the only one who noticed. I stayed up all night fixing that spreadsheet." He gave a small smile. "You saved that deal." He always took credit. I shrugged, not bitter, just tired. I let him. Back then it felt easier. Mr. Hahn's eyes softened. "But not anymore?" I met his gaze. "No, not anymore." There was a pause, then he leaned forward slightly. He said things in court no man should say about a woman he once loved. I looked away, not because it hurt, but because the truth was sharper than pain. It was clarity. I don't think he ever really loved me. I think he loved being admired beside me. Mr. Hahn exhaled slowly. "That's not love. That's performance." Something unspoken passed between us then. Not romance, not yet, but something older, deeper. Recognition. Two people who had both stayed quiet too long, who had both watched someone else shape the narrative. He didn't pity me. He didn't try to rescue me. He simply sat across from me, acknowledging every silent contribution, every overlooked brilliance. I felt seen in a way applause could never replicate. Not as a woman scorned, not as a side character, but as someone who had always been at the center, just out of frame. As the sun dipped lower, casting soft amber light across the rooftop, I finally asked the question that had been circling my thoughts since the trial. "Why did you keep the prenup?" Mr. Hahn took a breath, resting his hands on the edge of the table. "Because I knew one day he might forget who you were, and I didn't want the world to forget with him." His voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. "You built him. Maybe not the man, but the empire. I saw it." I blinked slowly, the weight of his words pressing gently on a part of me I hadn't dared touch. Validation that wasn't earned through a headline or a microphone, but through years of silent witnessing. "He changed," I said. "I didn't recognize the man in court." Mr. Hahn nodded. "Power reshapes people, but it reveals them first." That landed hard. I thought of the early promises, the shared ramen bowls when money was tight, the notes he used to leave on my mirror. Then I remembered the silence when the press turned, the way he watched me cry without reaching for my hand. I blamed myself for a long time, I admitted, thinking maybe I didn't shine enough to stay beside him. Mr. Hahn leaned in gently. Stars don't stop shining. Some people just choose to look away. My breath caught. For the first time, I realized it wasn't that I had been invisible, it was that he had closed his eyes. And now, someone else had chosen to open theirs. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not to fix my hair or choose the perfect earrings, but to study the woman looking back at me. There were lines I hadn't noticed before, shadows from sleepless nights, and a calmness that didn't used to be there. For the first time, I didn't see her as the ex. She was the architect, the witness, the survivor, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something new. The world still hadn't made up its mind about me. Some blogs called me a fraud, others a feminist icon, but none of them had lived my silences. I turned off my phone, tied my hair into a low bun, and headed to the place I hadn't dared revisit since everything crumbled, our first office space. The building had been repurposed now into a co-working loft, full of strangers and startup dreams. But the bones were the same. The chipped tile near the elevator, the smell of cheap coffee and ambition. I walked in unnoticed, and for once I liked it that way. I sat at a window desk where I had once sketched out our first pitch deck, and I opened my laptop, not to read the articles, not to relive the courtroom, but to begin again. A clean page, a new concept, no attachments, no compromises, just mine. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I wasn't chasing justice or revenge. I was simply reclaiming the part of me I had handed away too freely. And in that quiet space, sunlight on my face, I felt it. Not freedom, but authorship. The story hadn't ended. It had finally returned to my hands. Later that week, I got a message from a journalist I used to admire, someone who had once quoted him without ever asking for my version. She apologized, which surprised me, but what surprised me more was that I didn't feel the need to respond. I had spent so long chasing validation from voices that only echoed others. Now, I didn't need to be heard by everyone, just by the right ones. That afternoon, I went back to the courthouse not for another trial, but to file a quiet document, the launch registration of my own consulting firm. My name, my full name, stood alone on the form. No co-signer, no proxy. I watched the clerk stamp the page without hesitation, unaware of how symbolic it was. The same building that once echoed with accusations now held the paper that would carry my next chapter. As I walked out, I passed by the courtroom door, still slightly ajar. Inside, another couple was arguing, voices raised, eyes red. I paused not to listen, but to honor the symmetry. The cycle of hurt, of love, curdled by ego would repeat. But not for me. Not anymore. On the courthouse steps, Mr. Hahn was waiting. He held 2 cups of coffee and no assumptions. Didn't expect to see you here, he said. I took the cup. I had something to sign, I replied, smiling softly. He didn't ask what. He didn't need to. We sat on the bench, nearby, 2 people not trying to impress or fix each other, just sharing silence. And in that stillness, I realized healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up for yourself. A week later, my inbox looked different. Not crowded with gossip requests or interview offers, but filled with quiet inquiries from women, assistants, analysts, ex-wives who had stories like mine. Some were still inside their battles. Others had just begun to question the weight they were carrying for men in tailored suits. I read each message, slowly, carefully. They weren't asking me to save them. They just wanted to know if it was possible to walk away and still be whole. And the answer I finally knew was yes. That morning, I published my first essay, not in a magazine, not through a publicist, but on my own platform. Just my words. No filter. I titled it, The Fine Print They Never Ask About. I didn't name him. I didn't even mention the trial. Instead, I wrote about the invisible labor, how ambition often wears heels, how loyalty is sometimes paid in silence. And by evening, it had already reached thousands. Mr. Hahn sent me a message. You wrote what most of us only dare to whisper. I smiled, not for the compliment, but for the acknowledgement. He saw me before the world did, and now I was learning to see myself. That night, I lit a candle and sat by the window, rereading my own words. I wasn't the woman he left. I wasn't the woman they tried to erase. I was the woman who stayed standing. And not because someone handed me a stage, but because I built the floor beneath it. Quietly, carefully, brick by brick. The final court session was brief. Just a procedural wrap-up, with none of the spectacle or noise that had filled the earlier days. I wore a simple navy suit. No statement pieces, no dramatic makeup. Just calm, composure. When I stepped inside, he barely looked at me. His lawyer glanced over once, then back down at his papers. But the gallery was fuller than I expected. A few journalists, a couple of familiar faces from the old office, and in the very back, Mr. Hahn, silent, observant. I didn't expect anything more. I had already reclaimed my name, my voice, my place. But as the judge prepared to close the case, the opposing attorney stood and made one final attempt at damage control. Given recent rumors, he said, we'd like to clarify that the plaintiff was financially dependent throughout the relationship. There was no formal agreement, no contribution of legal standing. The judge raised an eyebrow, and that's when Mr. Hahn stood, calmly, with a leather folder in hand. Your Honor, he said, voice steady, as a third-party witness and CEO of the partner firm involved, I request that this prenup be entered into the record. The room went still. I turned slowly, barely able to breathe. The folder was familiar. I had signed it quietly years ago, back when love was fresh and trust was easy. A document that protected his assets and mine. My ex's lawyer froze. My ex himself looked like someone had slapped the air out of him. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, I didn't flinch. I looked forward, eyes clear, heart steady, because I wasn't there to defend myself anymore. I was there to close the door with the truth. The judge reviewed the document in silence, his expression unreadable. The courtroom, once buzzing with murmurs and shifting glances, had gone completely still. I could hear the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway, the hum of the ceiling light, even the quiet breath I held in my throat. Then, with a small nod, the judge said, "The document is valid and duly notarized. It contradicts prior testimony and will be added to the official record." Just like that, the narrative crumbled, not with shouting or scandal, but with paperwork. The same kind he once thought would stay buried. My ex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. For someone who once commanded rooms with charm, he now looked like a man cornered by his own reflection. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. But inside, something clicked into place. Not revenge, just clarity. Mr. Hahn returned to his seat without looking at me. He didn't need to. I knew what his gesture meant. Not rescue, not savior, just witness. And sometimes that's what matters most. When the gavel finally struck and the case was closed, I stood up slowly, one foot after the other, spine straight. I didn't rush. I didn't glance back. And as I passed by my ex, I caught the barest flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or realization. But that wasn't mine to carry. I had carried enough. Outside the courthouse, the city was alive again. Horns, people, wind in motion. But I paused on the steps, closed my eyes, and let the moment settle. The lies had ended where they began, in silence. Weeks later, I returned to the quiet cafe where I used to edit reports for him, back when I thought love was built on support, not reciprocity. This time, I sat alone, not waiting for anyone, not hoping to be noticed. I brought a book, not as an escape, but as a reminder that I could still be curious about something other than survival. The barista smiled as she handed me a pastry. "On the house," she said. "You look like you've been through something and won." I laughed, surprised. Maybe it was in my eyes, or maybe people sensed when a woman had stopped shrinking. That evening, I walked past a boutique window and caught my reflection. For the first time, I didn't compare myself to the mannequin inside. I didn't calculate worth by fabric or posture. I just saw a woman who had stood in court, been labeled, doubted, and still chosen not to collapse. Mr. Hahn and I met again, days later under no pretense, just coffee. He asked no questions about the past, only about what I was writing next. And I told him a guide for women who give everything and forget to leave a receipt. He nodded once, then said, "Make sure they know where to sign." That night, I opened a new document. Title: Terms no one can rewrite. Not a memoir, a manual, because I wasn't a footnote in someone else's story anymore. I was the author, and that, more than justice, was the victory I never saw coming. Would you have trusted the silence or demanded proof too?